All right, as people are logging on, I want to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Kim Montgomery, and I have the honor to moderate this webinar entitled A Decade of Science and Diplomacy. I am the Director of International Affairs and Science Diplomacy at AAAS, where I advise on bilateral and multilateral relationships, and I manage the Center for Science Diplomacy. AAAS's Center for Science Diplomacy is focused on demonstrating science diplomacy as an essential element of foreign policy, working to build a science diplomacy stakeholder community, and providing opportunities for science diplomacy training. In 2012, the center launched Science and Diplomacy to catalyze greater discussion about the issues at the interface of science and diplomacy. Throughout its first decade, it's been a space for rigorous thought, analysis, and insight into science diplomacy topics by a diverse group of scientific and foreign affairs leaders. Originally a quarterly printed journal, it was moved to an online publication in 2018. Since 2021, Science and Diplomacy has focused on special issues on relevant topics such as the role of science diplomacy in emerging technologies, invited perspectives on current issues like the continued invasion in Ukraine, that included one of our panelists today, Cathy Campbell, and publishing the Ambassador Interview Series. I want to make sure I'm acknowledging the longtime support of Bill Golden, Sybil Golden, and the Golden Family Foundation, which was instrumental to the launch of the AAAS Center for Science Diplomacy and helped make the publication Science and Diplomacy possible. I am very excited to moderate this webinar on our special issue celebrating Science and Diplomacy's 10th anniversary. The issue contains perspectives from 17 of the 23 authors who contributed a piece back in 2012, along with an editorial by myself and my colleague, Bill Koblaser. And we're privileged today to have 4 of the authors here that are making up this very impressive panel. The format for today's webinar is that each panel will provide introductory remarks. Then I will ask the panelists a few questions before opening it up to a general Q&A. I do want to remind the audience to please use the Q&A feature to ask their questions. And so I'm going to introduce all 4 of our panelists before turning it over to one of them at a time. And so our first speaker today is Cathy Campbell. Cathy has 4 decades of experience in international science and technology and securities programs, policy, and management. Currently, she serves as a member of the U.S.-Israel Binational Science Foundation Board of Governors and serves on the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Roundtable on Global Science Diplomacy. For 10 years, she was the global president and CEO of CDR Global, where she led science diplomacy initiatives and oversaw science cooperation with over 40 countries. Additionally, she's held positions in the U.S. Department of State, Department of Commerce, and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. She has a master's degree from George Washington's Elliott School of International Affairs and a BS from Georgetown University. Also, I'd like to point out that she's a AAAS Fellow and was a visiting scholar at the AAAS Center for Science Diplomacy. Our second speaker today is Dr. Robert Hormats. Dr. Hormats has worked as a senior official in the administrations of 5 different American presidents, including serving as the Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and Environment, and the Undersecretary of State for Economic and Energy Affairs, where he led the efforts of the State Department and planning of the G8 and G20 economic summits, as well as high-level bilateral economic negotiations. Outside of the public sector, Dr. Hormats has been a top executive on Wall Street and a major business leader working with companies in the United States and throughout the world. He currently serves as the International Advisory Board member at Edelman Global Advisory, and he has a PhD in International Economics from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, as well as an undergrad and a master's from Tufts University. Our third speaker this morning is Sir Chris Llewellyn Smith. Sir Chris is an emeritus professor of physics at the University of Oxford. He served as the Director of Energy Research at Oxford University, was president of the Council of the Synchrotron Light for Experimental Science and Applications in the Middle East, or SESAME, was provost and president of University College London, and was the Director General of CERN from 1994 to 1998, when the Large Hadron Collider was approved and construction was started. Sir Chris has a doctorate in theoretical particle physics from Oxford, where he was also an undergrad. He's received numerous awards, but we're proud to say that he was one of the 4 people associated with Sesame that received the AAAS Award for Science Diplomacy in 2019. And our final speaker today will be Dr. Lawrence Susskind. Dr. Susskind is a Ford Professor of Urban and Environmental Planning at MIT, the head of MIT's Science Impact Collaborative, and the vice chair of the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. He founded the Consensus Building Institute to help provide mediation services in some of the most difficult resource management disputes across the world. He received the 2011 Peacemaker of the Year Award for Mediators Beyond Borders, the 2007 Global Environmental Award for International Association for Impact Assessment, and was named Distinguished Educator of the Year by the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. Dr. Susskind has an undergraduate degree from Columbia and a master's of city planning and a PhD in urban regional planning from MIT. And so to start us off, I'm delighted to give the floor to Cathy Campbell.
Thank you, Kim. Let me begin by congratulating Kim and the Center for Science Diplomacy and AAAS and your colleagues on your 10-year anniversary. The journal has really provided an excellent forum for the exchange of ideas and information about models for science diplomacy in action. I'm going to say a few words about science engagement with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which was the topic about which I wrote 10 years ago, and then pivot to another country, which in my view requires urgent attention and action by the science and diplomatic communities. And that country is Ukraine. 10 years ago, I wrote about lessons learned from the US DPRK Scientific Engagement Consortium, which 4 organizations, CRDF Global, AAAS, the Korea Society, and Syracuse University, launched in 2007 to expand academic science engagement between the US and DPRK. That experience is a good example of the promise and the perils of practicing science diplomacy. The fact that we made the progress that we did, exchanging delegation visits to the DPRK in US, conducting English language training workshops for DPRK scientists, and launching the DPRK Virtual Science Library was extraordinary. We succeeded thanks to the creativity and perseverance of the organizations and individuals involved and their willingness to work through the many challenges we encountered. Some of those were the need to channel all communications through the DPRK mission in New York rather than communicating directly with the scientists, the difficulty of arranging travel, and just the initial challenge of finding a common understanding and language for communicating, given that we came from 2 very different science systems. In the end, the consortium's work essentially came to a halt after the DPRK resumed nuclear testing in 2015, and the international community, including the US, responded by imposing sanctions. The lesson learned, as Bill and Kim noted in their editorial in the most recent edition of Science and Diplomacy, is that science diplomacy operates in a context. And in this case, the security context made it impossible to continue our work. Now let's discuss Ukraine, which has a long history of success in many disciplines of science and engineering. As a result of Russia's invasion, Ukraine is facing enormous internal stresses as it concentrates resources to repel the Russian invaders. The effects on science in Ukraine have been devastating. Research funding has been cut sharply. Many scientists have been compelled to leave their current research positions. Some have joined the defense forces. Others have moved abroad or to a safer location within Ukraine. Scientific buildings and equipment have been damaged or destroyed. There are several initiatives underway by governments and think tanks to begin planning for Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. So far, these discussions have paid little attention to the role of science and technology in rebuilding Ukraine, where the science and diplomatic communities in the US, Europe, and Ukraine should work to correct. As the long-term planning ensues, there's much that needs to be done now to ensure the future of Ukraine's scientific talent and avoid the looming crisis of brain drain. We need to build on the good work that the academies of sciences in Europe and in the US are doing to provide research placements or financial support for Ukrainian scientists who have temporarily left Ukraine. There's an urgent need for financial support for Ukrainian scientists still living and trying to work in Ukraine. Much more needs to be done to link those scientists with collaborators around the world and create centers of excellence, if even virtual to begin with, to support young researchers. In short, we need to invest in some of the best and brightest in Ukraine so that they will be an integral part of rebuilding their country. This will not happen without a concerted effort by diplomats and scientists working together. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those insightful comments. And now it's my privilege to hand the virtual floor to Dr. Hormats.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for putting this together. And thank you for the 10th anniversary issue. I was honored to be part of the first one, and I'm honored to be part of this. What I'd like to do is divide my remarks into three short segments, one of which was what we did 10 years ago, another, how things are shaping up at the moment, and third, what we should be doing in the future. On the first point, 10 years ago, science diplomacy was really a very key element of American diplomacy, because in a way, if you look at America as a superpower, one of the reasons we were able to be a superpower was science and technology, the remarkable research that was being done here, the remarkable collaboration with other countries who wanted to send their scientists and their experts here to work in American labs, to work in American hospitals, to work with American science and institutes of higher education. And this gave us an influence around the world that no other country possibly could have had at this point, and was really a magnet for the best and the brightest from around the world. And it was also a conduit for American scientists and foreign scientists to work together. It strengthened America's image as a country that was doing things not just for itself to make itself a power, commercial and military, but also was working with other countries, and other countries wanted to share in the collaboration. So it really was, in a way, an attempt to bind the US and other countries and strengthen our scientific culture and the culture of our country and our influence around the world. 10 years later, that's not necessarily the case. 10 years later, we're now seeing circumstances where the notion of science being an important part of the American economy and an important part of America's influence in the world has really been diminished substantially, in part because of the skepticism a certain group of Americans, and indeed a criticism of the whole nature of science, the whole nature of experimentation. You saw this with the various treatments for the flu, the pandemic. Essentially, the fact that there were people who not only didn't believe in the vaccine, they were skeptical of the whole scientific effort that produced the vaccine. There was this sort of great skepticism about the science, the whole scientific community, what they said, this sort of increasing disbelief in the importance of science. And I think that that skepticism of a very substantial number of people has weakened us as a country, but it's also weakened our credibility abroad. And you add to that all sorts of restrictions on foreigners working with Americans or Americans working with foreigners, particularly on advanced scientific endeavors, has really made it worse. Now, in some of those cases, it's appropriate because increasingly advanced science does have not only beneficial scientific applications, but also beneficial economic ones, but it also has a series of military related issues that has made the US government and the US as a country wary about working with scientists from abroad because of the piracy of American trade secrets, American scientific secrets. And this has really cast a deep shadow over the kind of collaboration that we were able to enjoy. Because if there's a gap, one of the gaps is certainly the trust gap, and that trust gap between, say, the United States and China has grown, but it's also been true for other countries, China being, of course, the largest, but in general, we're much more cautious about this. And the government has taken much more restrictive action, in some cases for good reasons. In some cases, however, the baby's been thrown out with the bathwater because a lot of the collaboration, particularly in medicine, that was so valuable in developing new drugs has, in a way, been diminished in collaboration in other areas. So we're not as powerful, and in the past, I was ensured in my job that we had scientific attaches in virtually every country. We don't now, and we don't for the kind of reasons I've mentioned. Third point, I think scientific diplomacy now plays a somewhat different role, or can play, and that is with all these new technologies, AI, quantum, and a variety of new scientific developments that have been emerging in the US and elsewhere. We have no sets of rules or no sets of norms for making sure that these are used for the good of mankind, and as opposed to endangering mankind. I mean, for instance, using various cyber warfare techniques, interfering in elections, collecting data across borders, using science for military purposes that are counter to the interests of the United States and other countries. So somehow we're going to have to turn our scientific diplomacy today to developing the rules of the road, the norms, the mores, the understandings that avoid use of science, which should be for the good of the world and of our country and of the world, to make sure that it is, and to make sure that it is not being used to erode the sovereignty of other countries, erode the well-being of other countries, erode the democratic process, and strengthen the capacity of countries to make war against us or any other country, as we're seeing in various parts of Ukraine today.
Thank you so much for those interesting and very reflective remarks. And so our third panelist today is Sir Chris Llewellyn Smith. And so, Sir Chris, I'm privileged to give you the virtual floor.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to begin by thanking the AAAS for organizing this meeting and for the role that you've played in promoting science diplomacy and fostering a better understanding of its role. I'm going to speak about the role of science diplomacy in breaking down barriers and building bridges between people with very different political, religious, and other views. I may talk about other aspects later. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. A Pakistani physicist who I know well, who leads a group that participates in one of the large collaborative experiments at CERN in Geneva. And he told me that when he once wanted to take a group of technicians to Geneva to work on the detector, their initial reaction was, we can't come. The collaboration involves Israelis. These people are devils. We can't work with them. But he told them, you're coming anyway. And he said after a few weeks, one of them came back to him and said, you know, those Israelis are good technicians and they're decent guys. Scientists, engineers, and technicians who work together develop technical respect, which leads them to think that if their collaborators are so competent professionally, their views on other matters should not be dismissed out of hand. To put it another way, professional respect breeds tolerance, and I think that's important. Now, CERN was conceived in the late 1940s with two aims when they came together. The first was to enable the construction of a facility that was beyond the means of any one European country. European high-energy physicists realized that they would have to collaborate if they and to collaborate to build the facilities that they would need if they wanted to stay in the field in competition with the large accelerators that were being built in the USA. Second, a group of far-sighted diplomats and scientific administrators had the idea that it would be good to create an international organization that would bring together peoples who had recently been in conflict, this was in the late 1940s, and see if the French, Germans, British, Italians could work together again. CERN was in fact the first intergovernmental organization that the Federal Republic of Germany joined after the war, and CERN rather successfully kept open relations across the Iron Curtain at the absolute height of the Cold War. 10 years ago, I wrote in Science Diplomacy about a project in the Middle East called Sesame, which shares these aims. Sesame is designed to enable the construction of a facility that is beyond the reach of most of the members and bring together scientists, young and old, from countries which in this case they were not recently in conflict. Some of them actually are in conflict. The members include Israel, Iran, and Palestine, the others being Jordan, Turkey, Cyprus, Egypt, and Pakistan. Now, the name Sesame suggests opening doors, which is part of its purpose. It stands for Synchrotron Light for Experimental Science and Applications in the Middle East. It's a third generation light source based in Jordan. If you're not familiar with light sources, they're effectively $100 million microscopes. Well, this one's a cheap one. The others are much more expensive, some of the bigger ones. But they're large microscopes, or you can think of them that way, used to carry out applied and basic research in a very wide range of fields. And this makes them ideal for building scientific capacity, which is one of Sesame's aims. 10 years ago, when I wrote in your journal, Sesame was under construction. It is now in operation. Today, there were well over 1,000 registered users based in universities and research centers from across the region and beyond, who visit Sesame periodically to carry out experiments. Scientifically and politically, it is working. However, many of the members whose science budgets you could hardly see with a microscope find it hard to pay their modest contributions, let alone increase them to enable a really flourishing future of the facility. And we have run into difficulties because Iran, because of sanctions, has been unable to pay for many, many years. However, it is working, and Sesame shows that people of goodwill can collaborate across deep political divides, in this case, one of the deepest divides in the world. But, as I wrote in the latest edition of Science and Diplomacy, other collaborations are threatened by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The invasion has, for example, halted collaborations between Russia and other countries with Arctic coastlines who are working together on some really important issues with important implications for climate change. It's come to a halt. Soon after the conflict in Ukraine began, the presidents of the US National Academies expressed a commitment to keeping channels of communication with Russian scientists open. In June this year, however, the White House announced a widening down of collaborations with Russian government-affiliated research institutions. The G7 science ministers followed suit, albeit in more nuanced terms. They added the phrase, as appropriate. I think this is a worrying development for those who've witnessed the political and also the scientific benefits of international collaborations. Over 1,200 Russians, many of whom have condemned the invasion, participate in CERN's scientific program under agreements, however, with the Russian government and universities and research institutes, whose rectors and directors have issued statements supporting the invasion. CERN's members take different views on whether, in these circumstances, their participation should be allowed to continue. In June, the CERN Council, which had earlier condemned the invasion, declared an intention to terminate agreements with Russia and Belarus when they expire in 2024. So I understand that decision, but I regret it, and it's already having a serious adverse impact on work at CERN. I hope, but strongly doubt, that it will be reversed, and that the centuries-old tradition of scientific collaboration across divides will be maintained at CERN, as it is doing today in the Middle East at Sesame. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sir Chris, for those introductory remarks. And our final panelist today is Professor Susskind. So it's my privilege and honor to give you the virtual floor.
Thanks so much. Thanks for including me. I'm speaking on behalf not just of myself, but my partner, Shafiq Islam, a professor at Tufts, who co-authored with me both the piece 10 years ago and the new piece that we've contributed. I want to point out what I see as the evolution in science diplomacy over the last decade. And the evidence I'm drawing on is the training that I'm involved with, particularly for science diplomats from the Global South. I think the first thing of note in terms of the shifts or changes in science diplomacy is the recognition or acknowledgement that there are such things as social facts and not just scientific facts. And if you're going to do science diplomacy, you need to know how to take both into account. I think the second thing that's changing is that the problem-solving approach is now dominant. If you're going to be involved with science diplomacy, it's not just for the sake of science. Science diplomacy now, the majority of people who see themselves as science diplomats and that are involved in efforts working together are focused on problems and problem solving. And if scientists or diplomats aren't trained in how to engage in collaborative problem solving, they will not be able to be part of the evolving science diplomacy work that needs to be done. The third point is there is much more stakeholder engagement in science diplomacy than there used to be. It's not just about science and diplomats. All of the relevant stakeholders demand a chance to participate in the collaborative problem solving that is science diplomacy today. And how to identify stakeholders who can speak for the relevant constituencies, how to help prepare them to participate, that's what we have to improve. That's what we need to become more aware of. I think the fourth point is, and this is particularly a product of living through the current dimensions of climate change and in light of the current meeting in Egypt, I think there's an acknowledgement of increasing risk to society, even as uncertainty grows. And the combination of an awareness of increasing risks and growing uncertainty means that the products of science diplomacy need to be presented in contingent fashion. We don't need to say, given everything we assume, given everything we know, this is what we think is happening and ought to be done. What we need to say is, given what we don't know, given the assumptions we had to make, this is the range of possible actions, policy actions, other actions that can be taken. Here's what would cause the future to go this way or that way. And we have laid out in our work together contingent options for science diplomacy. And finally, I think it's absolutely crucial that the participants in science diplomacy, scientists, diplomats, and stakeholder representatives need to learn how to operate in a consensus building fashion. And I realize that from a scientific standpoint, consensus isn't as important as getting the facts straight or getting the science worked out. But in the world of science diplomacy, what we need is ways of working toward agreements on what we know and what we don't know, ways of working on contingent agreements. And I share Sir Chris's sadness. What we're now reaching circumstances where the political views of different states or people in different states make it hard for people to continue working together. My hope is that we will be able to have informal ways of working together, even amongst those whose states politically are unable to officially work together. I'll stop at that point. I hope there's another round we can engage in and comments and questions from the audience.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists for their very interesting and intriguing opening introductory remarks. And before opening it up to general Q&A, I will take the opportunity of being the moderator to ask you a couple of questions. I do want to encourage the audience. I'm already seeing some questions using the Q&A feature, so I encourage all audience people to put your questions in the Q&A feature. So my first question for the four of you, and some of you already hinted at potentially some of these, what are the most important issues facing science diplomacy today? And so I'm going to start off with Dr. Hormats. So what are the most important issues facing science diplomacy today?
Well, I would make 2 points, and they may be contradictory in some respects, but I'll make them anyway, and we can then see if we can come to a consensus. One of them is that the world does far better traditionally and for the last several decades when scientists collaborate across borders. And more and more academic papers are jointly authored by people from various countries who contribute to this, the conclusions and help the science to advance from different perspectives. And I think we don't want to do anything to nationalize what could be a very fruitful collaborative set of endeavors going forward. And yet I think there's a tendency to do this. The second problem is that increasingly, and this is the reality that we have to deal with, or governments have to deal with, and we have to deal with it as well, is that to some degree, advanced science does have, whether we like it or not, quite substantial military implications. And frequently the countries that have been involved in that are adversaries or are potential adversaries. And therefore our government, and indeed other governments, but let's talk about our own, has to be aware of this and make sure that what is done to advance science, potentially for the good of the world and the good of both countries, and has been in the past, does not shift over to an environment where the science is used for adverse military purposes, which affect the national security of the United States, or indeed of other countries, or undermine democratic institutions. And therefore finding, as I said, the sort of the guardrails, the rules of the road, the norms, the trust, which has evaporated. You can't have really good science unless there is trust. If the trust is evaporating or has evaporated and science is seen to be used for adverse purposes, then it is not going to work. However much we would like to see collaboration, it won't happen, and governments will not be willing to allow it to happen.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to hear from Sir Chris. So what are the most important issues facing that science diplomacy is facing today?
Okay, so to answer that question, I think I have to start by saying, what do I think is scientific diplomacy? I can't say which is the most important aspect without saying what are the aspects. So I think there are four. The first two are sort of sub-branches, if you like, of science and diplomacy. So first, science supporting international political objectives. And there, clearly, arms control is the prime example. Second example of science and diplomacy is science helping to meet global technical challenges. And there, obviously, climate change is the major example. The third is diplomacy for science, diplomacy facilitating international scientific collaboration. I've had a lot of experience of that. I negotiated the USA's presence in the Large Hadron Collider, also that of China, India, Canada, Russia. It's very important. And finally, science for diplomacy, scientific cooperation, improving international relations and building bridges between people. And I've already spoken about that, and personal contacts is clearly important also in helping with the first two aspects of arms control, personal connections between Ernie Monitz and the people in Iran when they were negotiating the arms control deal, the nuclear deal with Iran, I think were very important. But, and I must stress, as was just said, the advantage of individual collaboration for science, not just for human relations. So science benefits by having different perspectives. But clearly among these things, the most important have got to be arms control and climate change. And depending if you think, I mean, arms control has been on sort of a bit of a back burner. We didn't feel there was an imminent risk of a nuclear war, but recent events have made that seem not so certain. So that's clearly got to be extremely important. And I think in the climate change, probably even more important, because nuclear war, maybe we can avoid it altogether. It's looking very difficult to avoid climate change. I have mixed feelings about these international agreements. I'm working in that area, actually, and I've been at one of them. I find myself slightly appalled as a scientist by finding diplomats, or rather politicians, making pledges to do things where they've got no idea of the difficulty and are probably impossible. I mean, I don't think it's possible, unless there's something wrong with climate science, to limit the rise of temperature to 1.5 degrees. Nevertheless, even if people are making pledges to things without knowing how difficult it is, it's good that they make them because then they go away and try. So I think those meetings have had a positive impact, and let's hope something comes out of what's going on now. But as I say, I have mixed feelings about them from a technical point of view, if you like.
Thank you so much. And now I get to pose that question to you, Professor Susskind. So what are the most important issues facing science diplomacy today?
It's an impossible question, but I'll give you my personal view on a couple of things. I don't know if they're the most important. I look at the world through the eyes of and through the lens of a mediator. That's my work. And as a mediator, you bring together parties that are in conflict. There is no trust. There is no communication. They could be killing each other on the battlefields. And yet we create in a bubble a conversation aimed at trying to transform the current situation. And I see science diplomacy through this mediating lens. I agree, we have to define what we mean. I'm not talking about scientists talking to each other. I'm not talking about collaboration in science. I'm talking about problem solving in the world at large, and that science and science diplomats are engaged in informal problem solving aimed at producing proposals, not decisions. And those proposals then go to the formal state actors in all the multilateral and national forums that we have set up. We're not going to displace democratic decision-making with ad hoc science diplomacy. We're going to inform that decision-making. And my concern about the future of science diplomacy is that we need the scientists and the diplomats to be able to engage, to create forums for informal problem solving, informal work together, not on the grounds that they're deciding anything. We need for them to engage decision makers to help scope the problems that they're working on and to anticipate the reactions to alternative prescriptions that they could come up with. And if we can create these informal settings, we will then have better decision-making in the political world because science will be integrated into that activity. And I think we have to break down the belief that science diplomacy, because the word diplomacy is in it, is about decision-making. It isn't. It's about generating jointly informed proposals and options and arguments with evidence that then can be given to the decision makers who are the ones we hold accountable for making decisions.
Thank you very much. And Cathy, same question to you. What are the most important issues facing science diplomacy today?
Well, coming last in four speakers, I mean, the previous speakers have covered a lot of the issues that I would say. I totally agree with Dr. Hormats and what he said about looking at technologies, new and emerging technologies, and getting ahead of that by spending time now to talk about norms and how countries are going, science communities are going to work together as these new technologies evolve and we understand better what the benefits and possible risks of those technologies are. And also in terms of science to address global challenges, it's hard to argue with arms control or climate change. I would add health and just coming out of the pandemic and all the lessons that we have learned about the additional work that needs to be done in understanding disease and transfer of disease and developing vaccines. But I would also mention food and energy, which are problems that have emerged and come to the forefront, and particularly with the situation in Ukraine. And there are a number of factors explaining the food shortages, but I think this is an area where science can help to alleviate some of those in the future, and that it's an area where scientists where we can do more through science diplomacy.
Great, thank you so much. I think I'm already looking through the Q&A that the audience members have put in their questions, and I would encourage everybody to use the Q&A feature for your questions. One of the questions I was going to ask actually is duplicative in the chat, so I'm going to count it twice, and it basically is, how can science diplomacy overcome the increasingly complex geopolitical challenges our world is facing and continuing to make a difference? And so that was going to be the question I have. And in the chat, I see someone who's asking, how can we bridge emerging trends where science is most part influenced by politics or geopolitical dynamics? And so I would encourage you to think of both of those questions on basically science diplomacy operates within a context. That context is getting more challenging. And so how can it overcome and still be successful? And so it's a very not easy question, but I'm going to pass it over to Sir Chris first.
Okay, well, it's not an easy question, but first of all, I agree completely with what Lawrence said. It's not for the scientists to propose, it's the politicians have to take the decisions, the scientists have to make sure that they are well informed. And I think it's very much a matter of trust there. I mean, in the early arms control negotiations, which I know a bit about because I know old enough to have known some of the people who are involved, The Americans and Russian scientists involved hadn't necessarily met before these meetings, but they knew each other's papers. So they knew these are bloody good scientists. So, you know, I can take them seriously. So they trusted them intellectually, if you like. And this has been helped on a number of occasions. There was an occasion in the early 80s when there were negotiations, arms control negotiations taking place at Geneva. And I think the American delegation asked one of my predecessors as Director General of CERN, he said, could he host an informal dinner at CERN just between the Russian and American scientists, without the diplomats and scientists there, and see if they could, you know, with their personal connections and knowledge, come up with some new ideas. So I think personal trust is really important. And I think keeping the personal relations open, but it's very difficult because, as I said, the difficulty right now is that a lot of these individual exchanges are governed by international agreements. So you want to, you know, disown the signers of the agreement, but keep the individuals coming. It must help that at Sesame we've got Israelis and Iranians who probably never met each other before, and graduate students as well, actually meeting these people at breakfast, you know, in the hostel, and coming to realize, you know, we're all human beings. We've got this almost identical DNA, and trust each other. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what I'm going to say on it.
No, I think it's providing a lot of your insights, which is really helpful. And so now I'm going to give the floor to Professor Susskind to sort of talk about how does science diplomacy overcome these very challenging geopolitical times?
Yes, there are quite a few questions that cut to that issue in different ways. You know, in the climate research world, we have to represent future generations. If we take stakeholder engagement seriously, we have to represent future generations. Now, how can you possibly, without a time machine, represent future generations? Well, the answer is you use proxies, people who commit themselves to speaking from a certain perspective, do the homework necessary, and you could have several proxies, so people do that in different ways. What happens in a war when you're trying to have peace break out is often you have doves and doves from the two sides meeting secretly somewhere far away to begin to talk about under what circumstances would your side lay down their guns if this side would lay down their guns, if only for a short period of time. We meet in the absence of trust, but we expect people to be trustworthy during the meetings. We don't demand them to be trusting. We ask them to be trustworthy. We use proxies. So right now, in my university at MIT, we have all kinds of restrictions on formal relationships with Chinese counterparts. We have lots of people everywhere in the world, including at MIT, who can stand in for some of those groups that we cannot formally talk with for informal, early stage problem-solving discussion on a whole series of issues. And my feeling is, if you look, Sir Chris mentioned, you know, the activity during the Cold War. If you look at the Dartmouth conferences, which managed to maintain U.S.-Soviet interaction all during a period of difficult time, there were proxies who met on a regular basis, who tried to engage in problem solving. My feeling is, stop thinking about the science diplomacy as decision making and worrying who represents whom. Do you have the right to be there? How can this person speak for a country that has done these wrong things? You have individuals engaged in informal problem solving and in joint fact finding. And that continues. They generate what they can generate. They share it with those decision makers who have to deal with the different constraints.
Thank you so much, Professor Susskind. And then I want to pass it over to Dr. Hormats.
Well, I think that what Professor Susskind said makes a lot of sense. And it's not perfect, but it's reality in the current set of circumstances that we had, and that we had during the Cold War in another era. I would say, just to drill down a little bit, there is merit in identifying at least two areas. We're not going to be able to get everything done all at once, or have groups that deal with everything all at once, and AI and quantum and things like that, they're going to be really very difficult to do in a collaborative way, because the lack of trust is so apparent and continuing. But there are areas that benefit the entire world, where scientists on all sides can either get together or pose the kind of questions that need to be addressed by various countries, two of which are, one, the environment, where you do need the very best scientists from around the world, and it's a collective thing, since it in effect involves virtually every country and virtually everyone in every country. And the other is, there's going to be another pandemic. Every scientist in the world who knows anything about virology will tell us that. And we have to be ready. And being ready involves the best scientists from around the world trying to figure out how to anticipate it, what can happen, how do we collaborate together. So my thought would be to sort of, in order to restore what would be scientific diplomacy in quotes, and I understand we can keep the diplomacy out of it in terms of terminology, but really getting good collaborative science is what we need. And those are two areas that I think are going to be critically important. And if we put our heads in the sand and deny that and stop the kind of collaboration that we have had in the past, we're going to be robbing ourselves of this sort of collective scientific process for those two areas, which are going to cost lots of lives on all sides if we don't find some way of advancing those, even in the current very difficult environment.
Thank you so much. And I know it's challenging to go last, Cathy, but I want to get your thoughts on sort of how can science diplomacy overcome these complex geopolitical times?
Yeah, and it's very complex, as many countries are dealing with the issue of increasingly autocratic governments and politicization of science and lack of public understanding and trust in science. I think what previous speakers have said, I would agree with the notion that we do have to try to keep some channels and some connections open and find different ways to do that. For example, maybe there are ways to make better use of diaspora communities as a way to work to build and maintain trust that can be useful in the future. I also think looking at maybe some multilateral opportunities where it may be a safer environment or somewhat easier environment for trying to bring scientists together. And the last thing I think is constant education. We just have to continue to work and find ways for scientists to work collaboratively on the common problem that many countries are battling with, public understanding of science and public appreciation for science.
We have quite a few interesting questions, but I am conscious of the time, so I'm going to try to go very quickly, at least through some of them. And if some of the panelists would like to comment on them, but of course, if due to time, if not all of you, that is okay too. And the first one kind of segues right after our conversation on the challenging geopolitical situation. And we've talked about the continued invasion of Ukraine and Russia, but several questions are focused in the chat on China, which is not surprising. And one in particular is, what could US and Chinese scientists do now to maintain the scientific engagement? I've heard a lot of conversations about how personal relationships and collaborations are important, and how do you keep those together. So I don't know if anybody would like to jump in there on answering the sort of U.S. China question.
Well, I think Cathy's mention of diaspora is, I think, the first step. When we have a very substantial number of Chinese scientists available to us from outside China, and we can continue informal meetings to talk about different kind of problem setting and problem analysis and problem solving, and we can make the results of those conversations clear, although I wouldn't highlight who was specifically involved in them in what we publish about them, but we can continue moving discussions along. And it turns out, I'm not going to say this is true in China, but it's certainly true right now in Russia. There are all kinds of Russian scientists who have recently exited the country. And we should be providing a home for those folks. And they have very up-to-date sense of what's happening in that country. And I think it behooves those of us who care about this kind of communication to help them relocate to the institutions that we're part of.
Can I just add one thought? I think that using the experts who are benefiting us from this diaspora is extremely important. I think Cathy's point makes an enormous amount of sense. And all we have to do is go back in our own history after World War II, where we took a great many people from Germany and from Eastern Europe, and they were largely responsible for our rocket program, for the space race, for our own capability of building up our national security, and for enhancing the scientific community. So there's talent around. It's a matter of figuring out how we can take advantage of a wide variety of very skillful people who have left their countries, some of which are adversaries of our own, and come here because they wanted to be able to participate in the science and the technology and the creativity and the great research centers of our country. And that's a huge asset, which we should take advantage of and not forsake.
Okay, great. And I am conscious on the time, so I want to ask, somebody else asked in the Q&A feature to formalize and structure science diplomacy and have it work in sort of a systematic way across nations. Should governments appoint science diplomats in their ministries of foreign affairs? So this is a conversation that's been having for quite many decades on sort of a science advisor. Is that role needed in the ministries of foreign affairs, or you could even go and appoint science diplomats? So I don't know if anybody has any immediate thoughts on that. So Chris?
Well, I wouldn't like to see science diplomacy formalized, but the idea of having scientists in government is good. I mean, I think at least 10 years ago in this country, the United Kingdom, the Ministry of Defense had a scientific advisor, and there was a scientific advisor to the Prime Minister or the government. But since then, there is a scientific advisor in every single major department. And that's got to be a good development, that, you know, the scientist is available to comment on things. That's got to be good.
I know the time is running out. It's impressive to me that Chile has created a department in their foreign affairs ministry for science diplomacy. It's impressive to me that in Malaysia, the science advisor to the government and the person who has mobilized science advisors to governments all around the world is now creating an academy for training science advisors from the Global South for the Global South. UNITAR has organized to provide science training for diplomats from the Global South. There needs to be this consistent commitment to education and sharing of ideas for appointments of people who can participate effectively in science diplomacy.
I agree, and I'd also make one further addition looking inward, and that is very frequently, increasingly frequently, members of Congress are having to vote on bills that have a great deal to do with science, with a very small amount of knowledge of the science they are in effect voting on. And I think a much more substantial effort at home is required, particularly in the Congress, but elsewhere, to explain the scientific method, the benefits thereof, and the benefits of doing funding science in this country and of collaboration with other countries, because this is almost evaporated in Capitol Hill and other parts of our own country, sadly enough.
And just a quick comment, I've done a lot of work with Israel, and a lot of those government ministries have science advisors, and it works quite effectively. And then when I look at Ukraine, the work we're doing with Ukraine, I wonder if there would be more attention to science in the recovery planning if there were more scientists in the foreign ministry and other agencies involved in that planning.
Great. I know I could continue this conversation for much longer. I just want to highlight some of the themes that I've heard in this very short but really interesting hour conversation on the need, how professional respect builds tolerance, how there are social facts as well as science facts, the need to have science diplomacy focused on problem solving, the concerns over nationalizing international science cooperation, but also how to balance that with real national security issues. And really the need to build trust and the value of those personal relationships, and how do we keep those personal relationships connected through really challenging, difficult geopolitical situations. I want to thank all of the speakers today for participating in this event, not only for writing their piece for the anniversary issue, and I know that my colleague put the whole issue in the chat. I encourage everybody to read the entire 10th anniversary issue. But I want to thank you for taking time out of your day today for participating in this event. It's been really wonderful to hear your very insightful comments and thoughts. I want to thank all the attendees for sharing your time with us today and asking these wonderful questions, which have really enriched the discussion. I want to thank all the folks at AAAS who've helped me put on this event, especially Stephanie Ortiz-Calva and Katie Gardner on my team, as well as Kim from the meetings team. And I want to acknowledge the longtime support of Bill Golden, Sybil Golden, and the Golden Family Foundation that really helped launch Science and Diplomacy 10 years ago and continue to support other Center for Science Diplomacy activities. I want to just note that we've recorded this webinar, so we will post that on our website so that other people who were not able to join us today will be able to experience and listen to the webinar. So I want to thank everybody for their time and attention, and thank you for a successful webinar.